Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. In this video I want to spend some time talking about free will, and what I'd like to do is do so in the context of developing Peter Van Inwagen's theory of free will. Now, Peter Van Inwagen has written extensively on this topic, so I won't be able to cover everything that he says, but I'd like to cover at least some of the major points that he's made on this topic. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Let's spend some time doing some conceptual groundwork that'll be necessary for understanding some of the important debates within the free will debate. So, of course, we should begin with free will. What is free will? Well, according to Van Inwagen, we should understand free will as the concept that we have the ability to do otherwise. And so what this seems to involve, in part at least, is being able to choose among alternate possibilities. So let's just suppose that I freely went to the movies last night. Well, on Van Inwagen's understanding of what free will is, I'd have to have the ability to do other than what I in fact did. That other, at least one other option has to be something that's physically possible, and thereby it has to be physically open to me to perform. So if I freely went to the movies last night, then it had to be open to me not to go to the movies at the very least. So suppose instead of going to the movies, I could have stayed home and studied instead. Well, you need at least one alternate possibility than the one that you actually perform in order to act freely. So you have to have at least two alternate possibilities open to you. So sometimes this is called the alternate possibilities condition for free will. That seems to drop out of just the natural, so intuitive understanding of what free will amounts to. But there's a sense in which this condition hooks up with another condition, and these conditions should be very closely related, at least for somebody who thinks that having alternate possibilities is a necessary condition for having free will, like Van Inwagen does. So what's also required, it seems, is that you are able to control what you do. So going back to the example of my going to the movies freely last night, it has to be the case that I controlled my going to the movies, and likewise that I could have controlled staying home. So I control, you could put it this way, which future ends up being actual. I have a say, you could say, in what the world is going to turn out to be on the basis of my decision making. So having free will seems to involve having certain kinds of causal powers over which futures are realized. Now think about what this means. It seems to mean that I have the ability to render certain statements either true or false, as the case may be. So I can render it true that I go to the movies, or I can render it true that I stay home. But likewise, once I pick one, then I have the ability, and I thereby render one of the alternate possibilities false. In the case that I have in mind here, so I render it false that I stayed home and studied, for example. Now, of course, in many other normal circumstances, there's more than one alternate possibility. There's more than two alternate possibilities. There's several alternate possibilities that we are choosing between, you could say. And so this idea of having the ability to do otherwise, at least according to Van Inwagen, seems to entail having alternate possibilities to choose from, and the very closely connected idea of having control over what one does. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. That's the general understanding of the concept of free will that Van Inwagen's working with within his theory of free will. Now, within the context of the free will debate, there are several sub-debates, and one of the major debates is whether or not it's possible for an agent, a person who has the ability to act and perhaps the ability to act freely, can be free in a deterministic universe. Or perhaps put it slightly differently, the question is whether or not an agent can be both free and determined at the same time. Now, in order to deal with this question more carefully, what we'd have to do is figure out what the concept of determinism is, and then see how it relates to the concept of free will. So we've looked at the concept of free will already, so let's turn to the concept of determinism. And let's keep in mind that the concept of determinism that we're interested in here is the causal kind. And it's going to involve thinking about past states of the world, or perhaps even just a past state of the world at some given time, and the laws of nature, and what those two factors seem to produce in the world. Now, this is significant just because there are other kinds of determinism that one could theorize about. One could be talking about, say, theological determinism, whereby it's God that in some way, perhaps God's knowledge, determines what happens in a world. But that's not the kind of determinism that I'm going to be interested in this video, even though there are very, very good and even perhaps related kinds of questions about the compatibility of free will and theological determinism. So let's just focus on causal determinism, and I'll just refer to it as determinism here on out in these videos and make the qualification causal determinism when it's relevant. Okay, so what is determinism? Well, determinism, as I said, involves thinking about the past state of the world and the laws of nature. And this is something that's just straight out of Inwagen. The determinism is the thesis that the past and the laws of nature, they entail or they necessitate everything that happens in a world. So if we were to understand the past state of the world at some given time, let's maybe think about that as the set of statements that could be used to describe the past state of the world at some time. Now, no doubt this statement would be very, very long, perhaps indefinitely long, as it tries to describe the entire past state of the world at some given time, say 1,000 years ago. And then if we take that set of statements and we can join it with the set of statements that make up the laws of nature, the law of gravity, law of angular momentum, and all the other laws that we're discovering, say fundamental physics, that seem to be related to all the physical facts that exist. Once we can join these two factors, again, the past state of the world at some time and the laws of nature, whatever they turn out to be, then there is an entailment holding between what happens at the world. In fact, the past state of the world and the laws of nature, they entail everything that happens at a world. They entail every truth at a world, you could say. So if we're talking about the actual world, then the past state of the world and the laws of nature entail everything that happens at the actual world, or they entail every truth. Because presumably the actual world, the world that we're in, is the world where the truth is obtained. So that's a way of understanding what determinism is. Now we can imagine possible scenarios or possible worlds that are like ours, except they're just not actual, they're merely possible. We can imagine these scenarios involving deterministic scenarios, and deterministic scenarios hold true in these possible scenarios, hypothetical scenarios, if you will. And the very same thing would hold true about the past and the laws of nature in that deterministic hypothetical world. So the past state of the world and the laws of nature just entail any proposition that holds true, at any world. So that's a way of thinking about what determinism is. And so, as I've said, one of the big debates in um, thinking about free will is whether or not we can be both free and causally determined at the same time. In a way of um, thinking about the question is to ask whether or not were the world deterministic, could we still have free will in it? And so what I'm asking is if our world were deterministic, would we or could we act freely? In other words, could there be free agents in such a world? And Inwagen, he doesn't think that it's possible, and we'll come to this later, but the key thing to keep in mind here is that, at least intuitively, when we look at the concept of free will, it seems that it implies that an agent has to have more than one physically possible future open to her in order to act freely. So if I act freely, then I have the ability, or I have the options before me, say, of going to the movies or staying home. And you can obviously revise the case in many number of ways, but that at least captures the intuitive point here. Now, so it looks like free will requires having more than one physically possible future open to one when one acts, and this seems to be because of the alternate possibilities condition. But now thinking about determinism, given that there is an entailment relationship holding between the past and the laws of nature at a world and everything that happens at that world, if we're thinking about the actual world, if the actual world is deterministic, then the past and laws of nature until everything that happens at our world, well then what that means, what this entailment means, is that it's necessarily the case that if the past and laws of nature are what they are, then the very same future is going to result. So this means that the determinism has the consequence of being such that the past and laws of nature entail a single physically possible future. So you have free will on the one hand, which implies or requires even that there's more than one physically possible future. Determinism undermines that and says that in a deterministic universe, there would only be one physically possible future at any given time, given the past and the laws of nature. So there seems to be initial conflict in thinking about these concepts. Okay, but that's just to look at it rather superficially, at least at first. The philosopher who thinks that we have compatibility, or that we can have compatibility between the concepts of free will and determinism, or the philosopher who thinks that free will and determinism are consistent with each other, they need to tell a story, and they think that they can tell a story which accounts for how it is that we can secure free will in a deterministic universe. Now, the key thing here is they need to try to find a way of establishing how it is that we can do other than what we in fact do in a world where there's only one possible future. In other words, they need to find a way of accounting for the alternate possibilities condition. And what they typically do is say something along the lines of, well, if the past and laws of nature, say, consider those as a set, if they were different in any way, then we would have done other than what we in fact do. So the future would be different. And so you get multiple physically possible futures by considering ways the world could have been. And the way the world could have been is that the past and laws of nature are different than what they in fact are. And if that's the case, then we would have done different. And now typically what philosophers do is they'll focus in on, say, the local causes rather than these more global, distant causes, past and laws of nature. And they'll focus on things like an agent's psychology, her beliefs and desires, the things that seem to be relevant to her acting, the things that seem to determine, the things that seem to cause her actions. And they say that an agent can act freely, she can get alternate possibilities, insofar as her beliefs and desires are different from what they in fact are. If they're different, then she would have or could have done otherwise, and that is enough to get alternate possibilities. So let me stop there, and I'll pick up and talk a bit more about free will in my very next video. Thanks for watching, everybody.